So now the integument. This is lab 4. So the thing about the integument, first of all, the integument involves the skin, hair, and your nails, toes, and fingers. So the trick question is, what tissue types are involved in the integument? It's all. The epidermis is going to be epithelial, and that's the epidermis. Epi means top. Then you have dense, irregular CT, and that would be the dermis. So that's a lot of CT, a lot of collagen there. Then you have adipose, as just an example, which is loose CT, and that's the hypodermis. And hypodermis is also known as the subcutaneous. Cutaneous means skin, or the simply said sub-Q. So mostly adipose. So within there you have nerve tissue, written here at the bottom too. And those are mostly sensory receptors. So that leaves muscle. And there's a muscle in the dermis that's attached to the hair follicle, between the sebaceous gland hair follicle, and it's called the erector pili muscle. And that is smooth muscle. That's a question I always ask. It's smooth muscle. So in one way or another, you have all tissue types. You have epithelial, you have connective tissue, you have nerve tissue, and you have muscle tissue. So all 4 tissue types are represented in the skin. And that's what we'll call it too. Why this matters, Jeremiah, I really don't know. It all matters. So we're going to learn about burns a little bit. We're not going to go too deep into that, but tissue repair, maybe we'll go into. That's really more lecture. But as far as this, we're basically just naming things, right? And skin, hair, and nails, and in between you have glands. Glands are mostly epithelial tissue. And you have sebaceous glands, which is epithelial tissue as well. So this is mostly in the dermis. Sweat glands go through, they're exocrine, right? They go through the whole skin to the outside. So epidermis, epi means outer. Superficial is another word. I don't know if I said that in lab. Superficial versus deep. I probably did. And then you have deeper layers. So the next one is dermis. Remember, epidermis is avascular. So it relies on diffusion and osmosis to get its nutrients. Dermis, of course, is underneath the epidermis, and connective tissue, mostly dense, irregular, fibrous, collagen, fibroblasts, right? And that's very vascular. So a lot of blood supply in the dermis, not the epidermis. That's avascular. Hypodermis, they call it superficial fascia too. It's connective tissue. It's connecting things, I guess. This is a good connection too. Fascia connects things like muscle to muscle, or other connective tissues to other connective tissues. And they also call it the subcutaneous or the sub-Q. So if you're going to give an injection, right, like your nurses, right, Nurse Anthony Valerie, you take the syringe, right, and if you're just going into the skin, of course, you give them some collagen, you just give it a little bit into the epidermis. Then if you do a hypodermic, you'd have to go below the dermis into the hypodermis. So going into the dermis, if it stops in the dermis, that's more of a thicker area. It's vascular though, but most injections would be given subcutaneous, like insulin. People who take insulin will inject underneath the skin in the hypodermis. So some books wouldn't even consider the hypodermis skin, but I like to call it part of the skin, right? In some books. And it's mostly adipose tissue, which is connective tissue, loose, regular, or loose connective tissue. It insulates. Yeah, that's one of the jobs of adipose. And shock absorber. Anchoring pretty much any connective tissue anchors to bones, to muscles, to other organs. So here it is. Here's the skin. And you'll see this all over, like the practicals and the quizzes. You can see the outer part. And these are the hair shafts, right? Hair shaft. And then you really got to be careful here because you get different magnifications. So this is kind of easy to see where the dermis starts. And it kind of invaginates. The dermis kind of invaginates into the epidermis. So technically this is still dermis all the way along there. So know the first the 3 layers, and there's going to be 5 layers of epidermis. 5 layers in thick skin, 4 layers in thin skin. I think that my recording is important. So the one below, the layer below, is the dermis. And the reticular layer is pretty much the thick part. You might answer that. Like somebody on a quiz was just asking me, you know, I put reticular layer, or reticular dermis, and marked me wrong. So you could just say dermis, right? It's the whole layer. Papillary is the part that kind of invaginates, and like here, like here's the dermal papilla. It kind of plugs into the epidermal layer. That's how we get fingerprints, actually, on your fingers and toes. And then you have the subcutaneous or hypodermis. Both are correct. Subcu is fine too. Right, so that is your 3 layers of skin. And so now you have to know the goodies that are in there. Now the epidermis has 4 to 5 layers, depending on thick or thin skin. Thick skin has 5 layers, and what separates it is now we're going to talk about strata. The stratum lucidum is an extra layer, and it's called the stratum lucidum. So remember that now. So thick skin, 5 layers, is the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet. Everywhere else has 4 layers of, and I said skin, I meant epidermis, sorry. 4 layers of epidermis, and the thin skin lacks the stratum lucidum, just to give you a little heads up there. So know those big parts. So you could see all of this is hair follicle on here, and you could see the hair root within the follicle, and then it goes up into the shaft. The hair is being, you know, colored with the pigments, the melanin pigments. You have keratinocytes building the hair, and hair is mostly keratin, hair fibers themselves. And then you have these glands right here, and these are called sebaceous glands. And the sebaceous glands, they produce the sebum. Sebum is the oil, or oily substance. Lipid, sebum. Okay, so those are the big structures. Then we have my friend here, the erector pili muscle. See how it attaches? It's in the dermis. It's a smooth muscle. Remember, this is smooth muscle. It's not skeletal. Looks like it has tendons, though, right? Smooth muscle, called the erector pili. But you have to call it the erector pili. Don't just say smooth muscle. But I'd love that you know that it is. So I really don't know what this does. This erector pili muscle contracts, and then the hair stands on end, like, and that's called goose flesh, right? Goose flesh. When those erector pili muscles contract, maybe when you're cold, maybe when you're emotional, you hear a good piece of music or cello, piano, and all of a sudden your hair stands on end because the erector pili muscle is contracting. Goosebumps. Erector pili, smooth muscle attached to the hair follicle. So that is one function. I'm not really sure why we need goose flesh, except, you know, we don't have feathers as far as I know. I've never met anybody with feathers, so, you know, I don't think it's attractive. It's attracting other birds. I don't know. So maybe it just helps secrete sebum from the sebaceous glands. That's my best guess. It's kind of cool to talk about, and that adds the muscle tissue to this whole idea. So the erector pili, the sebaceous gland, the hair follicle, Sometimes they call this the hair root and hair bulb. All kind of means the same thing for our purposes. And then we have, the sweat comes out through the epidermis, but the glands technically are in the dermis. So you have an eccrine sweat gland. I don't know if there's any other types of sweat glands here. Sometimes you have a merocrine sweat gland. I don't see it, but there's different types of sweat. The sweat that you release from eccrine sweat glands is the watery sweat that helps us control our body temperature, where the apocrine or merocrine are more involved in like the oily sweat or the viscous sweat or the nervous sweat or the puberty sweat, the dirty sweat. So eccrine is more clean sweat glands. But you should know that this is a sweat gland. It's not nerve tissue. This is gland, glandular, like epithelial tissue, right? It could be stratified cuboidal for all we know, right? And I think it is, right? And then you have the pore, sweat pore, and all the red and blue are your blood vessels. You see that everywhere. And here's what adipose looks like in the subcutaneous, that yellow globular vacuoles containing triglycerides. Subcutaneous, loose connective tissue called adipose. So dense irregular connective tissue makes up the dermis. And then you have all these yellow strands. And these are nerve fibers. Like right here is a nerve ending, sensory for pain, maybe temperature. They kind of cross over, pain and temperature. These are more corpuscles or lamellar nerve receptors. They call them Pacinian nerve receptors. All right. Hair follicle receptor. I won't ask you that, but you should know that this is nerve tissue because the hair follicle, again, needs some nerve control. And so does the erector pili. Look at that. I'm not sure why the hair follicle. I'm just thinking. I'm not sure why that would need it except for sebaceous gland release. So the erector pili, I understand. You have motor nerves. So that's motor. To release something from a gland is a motor nerve, but sensory is more about fine touch. And these are for like deeper pressure, these lamellar corpuscles, they're called. They're nerve endings, sensory nerve endings. And you can answer any of those things. Dermal makes sense. I'm not going to ask you for dermal vascular plexus, but the hardest thing, I think, you just know what papillary layer of the dermis and reticular layer is. And all those main structures, sebaceous gland, erector pili, hair follicle, hair shaft, hair root is below the skin, below the epidermis. That's the best I could tell you there. So we'll eventually get to the layers of the epidermis. So mostly, really important, if you didn't catch this before, now skin is the only place that has this keratin, like this stratified squamous epithelium, and it's keratinized. So basically the keratin cells die and they kind of slough off your skin, and that becomes little dust bunnies under your desk and your bed. So the keratinocytes have the machinery, right, to build protein called keratin. It's kind of a waxy protein too. Gives it strength, it makes it kind of waterproof as well. So the major cells in the stratified squamous epithelium is the keratinocytes. And they're connected by this junction called desmosomes. That's the very common name for the junctions in stratified squamous epithelium. Millions slough off every day. So again, we've been sitting for a few hours and we've been mitosing our cells like crazy and we got skin everywhere. Imagine that. The cleaning lady will come on Monday. Melanocytes, melanin is a protein that produces pigment. So the more melanin you have, the darker your skin is. And there's different types of melanin. We might talk about that in lecture. Like there's eumelanin, which is more brownish, and there's pheomelanin, which is more reddish, lightish. So one's lighter. But melanin, for the most part, is darker, like brown pigment. Okay, and this is protecting us from UV damage, UVB rays from the sun, right? So it's protective, but it might have more functions than just that. Then the macrophages, this is important. I like this word. Now you're going to hear this a couple of times, but the macrophages, remember macrophages, the big eater in the tissue? We store it in connective tissue, but in this part, it's in the epidermis, and it's called Langerhans cells. So these are macrophages. Let's call them skin macrophages, so you remember. The big eater, tissue cell. It's a tissue cell, like a mast cell. So they're a little different shape. That's why this guy Langerhans, he must have been pretty brilliant. He found cells in the pancreas and in the skin, and he named them after himself. Okay, so they're activators of the second line of defense, because your skin, basically, your epidermis, is your first line of defense. And the layers of the epidermis, the 4 layers of the epidermis, and the second line of defense is these tissue macrophages as part of the second line of defense. Immunity. Then you have Merkel discs or Merkel cells. They're sensory receptors in the epidermis. So nerve tissue here. So Merkel, you have to remember all these names. I know it's hard. So dendritic means arm-like, with arms or branches. That's why it's star-shaped, dendritic. You're going to hear the word dendrite in the nervous system. It's a big part of the neuron. But it's like little arms or star-shaped. A starfish, yeah. So you have thick skin, which has 5 layers. But let's stop calling them layers, because when I say layers, you should remember epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. But strata now, stratum. So this is the way it goes from the bottom to the top, bottom to top. So what I do, this is the way I learn it. I say, okay, what's the bottom layer called? Those little cuboidal cells that are attached to the basement membrane. That's basal or basal, stratum basal, layer basal. This is an important one because there's many mitotic cycles going on down there in the stratum basal. And they're pretty prone to cancer too, because you've heard of basal cell carcinoma, which is not the scariest of skin cancers, but it's based out of this mitosis in the bottom layer. Then I go to the top, because this is a huge layer. That's many dead layers of keratinocytes, stratified squamous epithelium. Corneum, kind of like the pig skin. You know, that's the outside. And then I try to go in between. Like lucidum is the one I said is only in thick skin. So lucidum is right below the top layer. And it's lucidum because it's kind of transparent. It's kind of clear. So it kind of describes it. Corneum, I'm not sure what that means, but it kind of reminds me of pigskin. Corneum, outside. Lucidum, kind of transparent. So the next one is granular. So dark staining granules. And it's got melanin as well, you know, in the granules of the proteins. So stratum granulosum would be next. And spinosum, it's kind of big. It's kind of wide. So I think when you look at the skin, like you'll see a big spinosum and a big corneum. Basal is only one layer, too. Lucidum is only in thick skin, palms and soles, and that's transparent. The granulosum is kind of dark staining. And then I just say, okay, everything in between is light staining, is the stratum spinosum. Staining means what the histology stains with the chemicals that give it color. You know, it gives you resolution. You can see the difference between different structures on the same microscope slide. So stratum is the deepest, and that's the one that is attached to the dermis. We have the papillary layer of the dermis invaginating into it. Highly mitotic stem cells, right? That's where they all start. So look at this. It takes almost 45 days for that stratum basal to not grow up, but mitose into the stratum corneum. Not bad, but everybody's different, right? How fast does your hair grow? Doesn't matter, my hair stopped growing. So as the cell goes towards the surface, they die. So they're lively down here in the bottom, right? And then at the top, we have dead stratified squamous keratinocytes, basically. Yep. So above that, actually, stratum germinativum is another name for stratum basal. That's why they call it germinativum, is like stem cell. Yeah, so if you can remember that. It's not another strata. Stratum spinosum is a prickly layer. I don't see it, but okay. So it's thick and it's light staining, and this is pretty strong. You have keratinocytes in here. Keratin is huge in the skin, and I guess that's what appears spiky if you really look at high magnification. And melanosomes have DNA for the melanin, right? Making more melanin in the epidermis, which is another place where we convert vitamin D, right? We get vitamin D from the UV rays. It's a good thing. And that's how we get vitamin D converted in the skin, in the epidermis, right around the stratum basale, actually. So, stratum granulosum, this is granular. Appears thin. This is not a thick layer like the spinosum or the corneum. So they're flatter. They're all simple, stratified squamous, I keep saying simple. And you have keratin fibers. That's all you have to remember about that. And it could be water resistant because of the keratin. And you have avascular. Avascular, you don't get a lot of vascularity in that area. It's all in the dermis. Stratum lucidum, translucent, which is transparent. So that's only in the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand, right? Dead cells too, keratinocytes, between the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum. And you'll see pictures of that soon. This is the stratum corneum, horny layer like horns of a cow, I guess. And the dead cells, this is all dead. It kind of looks wiry sometimes. It depends on how bad the histology was destroyed when it was put onto a microscope slide. All right, so this is really the area of protection. This is the stratified squamous, preventing water loss, protecting from penetration and abrasion of anything. So this is our first line of defense. It has like an acid mantle, which is bacteria, antibacterial, right? And it has an acid layer. That's why it's chemical. It's a little more acidic, which is antibacterial as well. So this is a classic keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So the epidermis is all epithelium. That's easy to remember. Apoptosis, mentioned this. This is a programmed cell death. You know, as the cells die, they slough off. Dander for dander in animals. We have dander too. Dried out hair, dried out skin. You know, humans can shed 50,000 cells every minute. 50,000 cells every minute. How many minutes have we been sitting here? I better get a new cleaning lady. Okay, so here we go. Here's the layers, in cartoon version anyway. Or do we have the stratum? So look how thick this corneum is. And this is really what it looks like, all of this in here. Stratified squamous. Then you see a dark staining granulosum, and then stratum spinosum. And then you have your stratum basale, just one layer. This is dermis. This is dermis. So look at the cartoon. Look at I guess that's real anatomy, yeah. With the purple stain on your left and the cartoon on your right. So when I say strata, that's the 4 layers of the epidermis. And be really careful with this because it's going to change with different histology. You can see this is dermis here. This is dermis. Invaginating into the stratum basale is just the one layer of cells. The rest is spinosum. Granulosum is right below the corneum. And there's no lucidum on here, so this must be thin skin or non-thick skin. And then the dermis, the layer below. And this is where you have a lot of collagen-laying cells called fibroblasts and macrophages, which are your tissue defense, second line of defense, and mast cells that produce histamine, and white blood cells like neutrophils and lymphocytes. They're from the blood. The hide that you use for leather. So if you have leather shoes on, here you go. You have a dermis of some other mammal, if that's your thing. And nerves, mostly sensory, but you see you had motor nerves going to sweat glands and sebaceous glands and erector pili muscle. So there's nerves for controlling those things and sensory for what we feel. Very vascular, right? Vascular blood vessels there. And lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels, and the function we have to know right here is that they reabsorb excess fluid. That's really what the lymph system does in the tissue. So it gives a nice osmotic balance by draining out that extra fluid that's not reabsorbed back into the blood vessels. But it has many other, not many other functions. It's immune, has immune functions, and it carries dietary lipids. But this, for the tissue, it's important to know it reabsorbs excess fluid. It kind of goes along with the veins. 2 layers. Papillary is the one closest to the stratum basale of the epidermis. Reticular is all the thickness of the dermis. So there you have it. Here's a nice picture. This one I like. This one shows you a lot. So all of this is basically stratum corneum. Maybe if you look close, you could see a stratum lucidum in there. You see that translucent line right here? It could be that. And then here's would be your granulosum. All this would be spinosum, and stratum basale on the bottom. And this is dull dermis in between. So maybe you should do this. Like when, again, we're not in the lab, you can't change magnification, but like say this was like scanning power 4x, right? Times 10x of the ocular lens. And then you go up to low power at 10x. And then you can go up to high power 40x and see closer. You know, so if you could do that with your PCs, Chromebooks, and cell phones, whatever. Okay. So the dermal papillary, or the papillary layer of the dermis. So that's the finger-like projections up into the epidermis. There's a lot of nerve endings there. Corpuscles for pressure, Meissner's, Pacinian, corpuscles, touch receptors, nerve endings. We're going to talk a lot about that later. You also have your friction ridges, part of the papillary layer, and the dermal ridges, which pretty much give you the fingerprint pattern. I'm not going to ask you a lot about that, but you should know that the dermis, the ridges, will give you the fingerprint. So you basically, your fingerprints come from the top of the dermis, invaginating into the epidermis through these dermal ridges. Like fingerprints, there they are, kind of skin markings and folds, friction ridges. Then you have the little ducts for sweat going out of the skin to the surface. Reticular layer is the big, thick layer, right? Dense fibrous connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue. And there's elastic fibers within there. Remember, there's elastic fibers, then there's elastic connective tissue, which is what this is. And then don't forget, there's elastic cartilage too. And there's only 3 places we have elastic cartilage. Seemed like a long time ago we were talking about that. So this is good. Cutaneous plexus is, whenever you hear plexus, it usually has something to do with networks of blood vessels or nerves. So we don't have to worry about that right now, right? So don't worry about cutaneous plexus or extracellular matrix in the dermis. Just remember the dense irregular connective tissue and the sebaceous gland and the erector pili and the nerves and the sweat glands and all that stuff. That's important. This looks like it's all from lecture too. So tension lines in the reticular layer. And I have another narration of this too for lecture, so we can get through this kind of quick. Again, I'm not going to ask you about the dermal markings and flexure lines. Not so much. There's a lot in here. This is like basically your lecture, so we can go through this kind of quick. Blisters, you know, those fluid-filled pockets that happen on the outer layer of the epidermis. Stretch marks, kind of like overstretching, and you get that like wiry, silvery, and reddish marks along the skin, like scarring. So skin color comes from melanin, of course, and that's the protein that gives you the color. So this is a lot. I'm going to have to get you a smaller PowerPoint. This is too much in it. I'm talking about different skin colors and all the different things. So just to kind of truncate this a little bit. I like this, though. I want to talk about this. like the different colors of the skin. Like cyano means blue. So your skin, so you could do a good breakdown of the skin, you know, finding out the health of a person, right? That's really the first thing you see. So blue skin, even in the lips or the fingernails around the eyelids, is usually low oxygenation. So you have hemoglobin that's missing oxygen. Pallor is like a whitish blanching, lose that redness. That could be low blood count, like anemia is low red blood cells, or a drop in blood pressure. Anxiety, right? Fear, anger. Erythema or erythema, anything with a rith is redness, like high temperature, maybe hypertension. You don't always see that. Or inflammation, things get red. There's too much histamine in the area. You just got stung by a bee and it's reddish. A lot of blood filtering and vasodilation. And certain allergies cause redness. Jaundice is yellow, and that's liver disorders. So let's see what else is on this PowerPoint. I got to get you a more straightforward PowerPoint because this looks definitely more lecture related. So I really don't talk that much about hair, to be honest with you. I don't want to go into that in lab because I want to get into the tissue of the actual skin like we did. So this is kind of more lecture. This is going into the hair follicle, the bulb on the bottom. It has a receptor that wraps around the bulb. I mentioned that before. So it's really like the hair is an extension of a receptor. Not really, though, but it's sensitive. And a lot of your receptors and your special senses are based around that. So really, that's hair bulb. You just have to kind of know where it is for now and know where the erector pili is. This is the actual bulb in the root. You can see what's going on here. You have the sub-Q. And this is, remember, this is all in the dermis. The hair follicle is mostly in the dermis. And the hair papilla is the bottom, where now this is the same. It's pretty similar to the epidermis with a very mitotic layer right here. And then again, I don't care about all this cuticle. I'm not going to go into hair deeply. So when you see it in the hair model, you should know that that is a hair follicle. Vellus hair is that fine hair, mostly in children, vellus hair. Terminal hair is that coarse, longer hair. So that's something I will star there on this recording. And I'm not going to really talk about hirsutism when it comes to skin. Alopecia is hair thinning, normal male pattern baldness. Another name for that is alopecia. So the hair follicles stop mitosing. I'm not going to talk about this. Yeah, sorry, I don't know why this is in here, but it's got too much. And nails, I don't want to go into. You have enough to worry about with all those tissues and all the different parts of the nail. Not interested. Sweat glands, okay. So you have your eccrine and apocrine. All right, so eccrine is more the sweat gland that loses water, helps you lose water. And that's the one you should know. The eccrine, that's the most common one. Okay, so again, we'll go through this. So here you go. This is the model, what you're going to see, and I narrated one. And in your lab book, this is what you're going to see. Again, we can't use the lab book together because I'm not even sure if everybody has one. But again, really important. Apocrine is a little bit different areas under your arms, and those areas that's a little more viscous sweat, more puberty sweat, apocrine versus eccrine. That's really all you have to know. Ceruminous glands, you should know. Cerumen is the earwax. So that's epithelial tissue within the skin that produces that waxy substance in your ear, and that's called cerumen, right? And mammary glands secreting milk from epithelium. So a little bit more about sebum. You don't have to know about holocrine. Just know sebaceous gland secretes sebum, and that's the oily substance on the skin. Yeah, this one you should know. Like looking at this picture, you go, okay, this is the sebaceous gland. So definitely look at this. And here, this is all dermis out here, and this is the hair follicle. So this one I would start. This one you should know. But this is really what you have to know, everything on this picture. For me, anyway. Again, we'll revisit this in lecture, but for lab, that you have your hands full with the tissues. Or wait till we do the bones, skeletal system. It's a lot. So I like these tables because it just gives you a little breakdown of the different glands, and this is the one I'm going to mention the most, the eccrine sweat glands, right? These little blue ones, smaller. But all you have to do is say sweat gland, to be honest with you. But you have to know sebaceous versus sweat gland. How's that? That's fair. Right? Unless you want to be a dermatologist soon. And this just goes on. Again, this is more lecture. I'm not going to go into that. Whoa, that's seborrhea. Yeah. That's a really cradle cap. So functions of the skin, pretty much save that for lecture. Physical, chemical barrier. Of course, we know the physical part. The biological is the macrophages, the second line of defense. And the chemical is kind of an acid, antibacterial fluid that's secreted through the sweat glands as well. Acid mantle, like that word, acid mantle, decrease the pH, which is going to slow down the production of bacteria, proliferation of bacteria. So again, this is way too much here. Really, all I want you to know is the strata. We'll get through that today. So this is basically it. So here, back to this. And just to review, where the epidermis starts and stops, the dermis begins. Top is papillary, bottom reticular, subcutaneous, mostly adipose. Your hair follicle, hair shaft, and sebaceous gland, erector pili muscle. Then you have your sweat glands. This is your lamellar sensory receptors or corpuscles. Here's another one. These are nerve endings. These are more motor. And these are nerve endings up in here for pain, temperature. Free nerve endings, actually. Sweat pore. So that's the big part of it. And you could see this, again, in lab, we'd be just looking at slides of the same skin over and over. We wouldn't be spending that much time. You should know about the synthesis of vitamin D, because vitamin D is important for us to absorb your dietary calcium. So without vitamin D, you could eat all the calcium you want. You won't get it to be absorbed unless you have vitamin D. Blood reservoir, again, this is definitely more lecture related. So the skin, cancer, and burns, right? Different skin cancers we could show you, different burns. 3 types of cancer: basal cell carcinoma. You've heard of basal, remember stratum basal. So where is this? Sorry. Let's do it this way. Basal cell carcinoma is ones that are, it's still cancer and it can become something worse. But this is probably the most treatable of the cancers. And I bet you if you get screened, there's always something that looks suspicious. That's basal cell. So it's really kind of round. It's not too dark. It's not elevated so much. It's not irregular around its margins. But still, it's still cancer. It still has to be treated. So squamous cell carcinoma involves the keratinitis, mostly in the stratum spinosum. So that's good to remember. So just know the cancers and know these pictures. That's squamous cell. So this is a little bit different. It's a little bit irregular. It's got different colors. It's not homogeneous. That's squamous cell. Melanoma is the worst. Melanoma is the worst. So I like the A, B, C, D, E rule. So A is it symmetrical? Is it perfectly round or irregular in shape? B would be the border. Does it look like Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic, or is it kind of round like a nice island? So the border. The color, is it dark? Is it yellowish? Is it red? Is it rusty color? And D is the size, the diameter. Like how big is it? And has it grown? Size of a pencil eraser. And E is elevation. And that would be, is it coming up off the skin? Not necessarily, any of these things by itself is not necessarily a cancer, like especially a melanoma. Because melanoma is going to get into your blood. It's highly metastatic. Means it can go into your blood vessels and spread to someplace like the brain. So this has to be treated. This is a very bad cancer, as opposed to basal cell, which is the most basic and the best mortality rate and the best outcome. So those three cancers, hopefully we'll see. This is melanoma. This is, again, it's got a lot of those ABCDs, and it looks destructive, doesn't it? Like compared to like that basal cell, it looks like just a mole or a bump. And a normal mole is dark too. You could have a nevus. A nevus is a mole. Nevus is a mole that's elevated, but it's usually pretty round, and it stays the same shape and border and margins for a long time. Now burns, again, if anybody's an EMT in this class, you know about burns and tissue damage. It's like denaturing proteins, right? It's a hostile environment, like we did with heat, or chemical burns, of course, or electrical burns. So we're not going to do the rule of nines in this class. So, we're just going to, this is what I want you to learn though here. Now we're recording this. First degree burns involves just the epidermis, right? And somebody had second degree burns, I think, in this group. Second degree burn involves the epidermis and the dermis, okay? Third degree burns involve all three, epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. And this is, of course, the worst one. But to tell you the truth, the one that's the most painful is probably second degree burn, because you still have nerve endings in there. Like with third degree burn, the burn goes straight through all those sensory receptors. So yeah, here's a picture. Put both first degree burn and second degree burn. This you might see on the exam. Like this is blistering. Second degree burn is blistering to the dermis. First degree burn is like a sunburn on the skin, but in this case it was probably on a stove or something. And third degree burn takes away all that vascularity and exposes that hypodermis region into the subhypodermis region, which is a lot of blood vessels. So you're losing fluids here. This is very, very bad. Third degree burn. So this is about treatment of burns, and I'm not going to do the rule of nines. We're not going to do that, okay? And what this other stuff is here, I will keep it off your exam, okay? So basically with the integument, we're going to go through a little bit more in lecture, but know the model, know all those parts that I told you about. Other than that,